A relatively new face, but nonetheless important one on the reform scene is Zia Yusuf, chairman of Reform UK, and he joins me in the studio now. Zia Yusuf, thanks so much for joining us. I want to talk about your party and its insurgency at the moment, but let's talk about what we were just talking about with the Defence Secretary, John Healey. From what we're hearing so far, and obviously we don't have all the details, do you welcome broadly what's being said in the Defence Review?
I think the country does need to spend a lot more money on defence. Nigel is very much of the view that we need to be a country that believes in peace through strength. But what I will say is, often these discussions about defence spending are through a prism of percentage of GDP. And you've got Labour saying we're going to spend more as a percentage of GDP. We actually think they'll get there, but not as a function of increasing defence spending in absolute terms, but more likely by actually reducing GDP. We've got to get our economy growing again. Look, a lot of these conversations, frankly, we think are fanciful. We are not the force on the global stage we once were. We can be a force on the global stage. We've got to get an economy that grows. We've got to invest in a military that has, frankly, been hollowed out, Lewis, and that's what reform will do.
Do you agree that Russia is the most important and profound strategic and geopolitical threat to the UK right now? So let's be clear about in terms of foreign threats. Yeah.
Yes. But I do think the insane numbers of people, you just asked him and I think his answer was very poor. We've got a ridiculous number of people still penetrating our borders on a daily basis. Yesterday, well north of 1,000, potentially a record. And we have now got confirmation that one of the people, at least, who came across was involved in a foiled terror plot. This is absolutely a national security emergency. And the fact that that has still not been described as such after 14 years of Tory rule and now almost a year of Labour rule is a catastrophe.
Indeed. But Russia is obviously, in geopolitical terms, very important. Nigel Farage has come in for criticism before in terms of what he has said about Russia. So I just want to clarify what your thinking is and what his thinking is now. He obviously said in 2024 in the election campaign, it was obvious to me that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was giving this man, i.e. Vladimir Putin, a reason to his Russian people to say they're coming for us again and go to war. Do you agree with that assessment?
People choose to selectively quote and mischaracterize what Nigel believes.
Quote. That's what he said.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying you are. What I'm saying is generally what people try to do. Look, they throw all of these ridiculous, epithets at us, right? They call us racist. We've just been called a Nazi by Keir Starmer's lawyer.
That's irrelevant.
And the Putin sympathiser accusation is completely false.
I didn't call him a Putin sympathiser. I quoted what he said. I'm just asking you, and people do say this, so it's not a completely outlandish thing to say. There are people who think that NATO's expansion was at least one of the main drivers for the war in Ukraine. And it seems to be what Nigel Farage was saying in 2024. I'm just asking you whether you agree with that assessment.
Lewis, we are in a situation where clearly Putin is acting appallingly and abominably. He is a major national security threat, and this country needs to respond to that threat. That's what matters. Look, Nigel has been crystal clear. He thinks Putin is an appalling dictator, and he thinks this country needs to have a formidable defence in order to defend itself.
You would agree that any state in Eastern Europe that wants to join NATO should have been allowed to do so, and there's no explanation or excuse for the war in Ukraine?
So, look, yes, I would agree with that statement. But I'd also say, Nigel has been quite prophetic about a lot of these things. It was more than a decade ago he stood up in Strasbourg and he actually said, look, if you carry on going down this path, you are risking the actions of someone who is an abominable dictator, right, and is extraordinarily callous with human life, including his own citizens, by the way, including journalists in his own country. Yes. And what we care about ultimately is keeping British people safe. And I put it to you, one of the reasons why as you said, we are leading at a canter in the polls as things stand, is because people they know in their bones that Nigel believes in this country. No political leader, Lewis, has done more to stand up for veterans, to tell the stories of what the great British military has done, and to flag how hollowed out our military is. And I want to say one more thing about our military, Lewis, because it is being defenestrated and it is being de facto disarmed by a judiciary and international courts that effectively should have no jurisdiction on these matters.
But to be clear,
and there's nothing about that's remotely acceptable.
To be absolutely clear, it is nothing. The war in Ukraine, eastward expansion of the EU and NATO, that is not the reason for the war in Ukraine. You would agree with that?
The reason there is a war in Ukraine is because Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine and breach their sovereignty.
Yeah. And there is no excuse in terms of NATO expansion as a result for that.
No, not at all.
Okay, that's very clear. Nigel Farage, you said let's go to his speech this week and the different tax measures that you've been announcing this week, because they're very, very significant. A lot of money on the table, at least you say you're going to cut. I think 300 billion of public spending potentially.
Probably more in Nigel's first term.
More than 300 billion of public spending. So given that UK total public spending is north of $1 trillion, we're talking about a third or so of that money.
Well, hold on. So the annual budget's about 1.2 trillion.
Indeed.
That north of 300 billion is over the course of Nigel's first term.
In the course of the
across
term.
5
Okay,
years.
fine.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. One of the components of that is you've said you will eliminate the foreign aid budget in its entirety, completely. Every penny piece.
Well, we'll have to see where we are in 2029, Lewis, but I will tell you this. I think it's unconscionable for this country to be sending money to India, a country with a space program and hypersonic missiles of which we can only dream, while Welsh 13-year-olds have an educational attainment below the OECD average.
So
there's nothing about that that's remotely acceptable.
So there
Lewis.
would be no, in the event of, say, a famine somewhere in the world or a natural disaster somewhere in the world, we wouldn't spend any money whatsoever to assist, even if it were a matter for life and death.
We take the business of governance seriously, Lewis,
Okay.
and we're now in control of 10 councils. So, look, of course, we're going to be practical about this. And one of the things we've also committed to, by the way, for example, is deporting everybody who is here in the country illegally. Now, could foreign aid... There are countries, for example, that are in receipt of significant amounts of foreign aid of this country that are refusing to even take back their citizens that are languishing in our prisons. And as a result of that, we have a prison overcrowding problem, Lewis. So we've got to take governance seriously.
Indeed, and that's why I'm asking you about it, because you've said you would eliminate foreign aid. So I'm just asking, is that a blanket ban? There would be no exceptions, no matter what happened in the world, you wouldn't spend a penny piece?
No, what we're saying is it would be massively reduced from the 15 billion that we're spending at the moment. Of course, if there's a famine, Lewis, if there's a famine in which we think the British government can be helpful, of course, we're very practical about these things. But I want to reiterate, one of the things that I find extraordinary as someone who only came into politics about a year ago is that whenever it comes to foreign citizens, free accommodation in asylum hotels or HMOs, there's infinite money. When it comes to foreign aid, there's infinite money. When it comes to giving away our sovereign territory,
because they're reducing it.
It's infinite money. When it comes to British pensioners, when it comes to British children, when it comes to British workers, we're always told there's no money left.
Let's talk a little bit more about that money. So you and your leader are asking us to take you seriously as a party of government. Your leader, in his speech this week, said that partly his massive programme of tax cuts would be financed by ending the 45 billion of annual spending on net zero. Where does that figure come from?
So the 45 billion is a total function of a number of factors. So the amount of money that is inside government budgets explicitly that can be cited directly from official sources is north of 12 billion, probably closer to 14 billion. Then you have, for example, the lost revenue to the exchequer, for example, in terms of fuel duties, right? So we've got the intervention into private markets and the subsidies on electric vehicles. Nothing wrong. I actually like Teslas, but the reality is we do not think the government should be accelerating the rollout of electric cars much more quickly than private citizens want to buy them. The total cost of that is probably actually north of 45 billion.
The OBR has said that by 2050, government spending on net zero would be 10 billion a year, accounting for savings. So where's the other 35 billion coming from?
So there's a climate commission report from about 4 years ago, right? And that does talk about a number much bigger than that.
Well,
but Lewis, there was never been.
The climate change
costing of this.
The climate change
it was actually
committee
waved through without a vote.
The climate change committee says net zero will require investment of 26 billion a year, 2/3 of which will be provided by the private sector. That's got nothing to do with the government. So I ask you again, where has this 45 billion figure come from? Is it just plucked out of thin air in Nigel Farage's most fetid dreams?
No, as I said. So number one, a lot of these bodies have a vested interest in a lot of this stuff because, and I'm not even criticising them.
The OBR?
Because
What's OBR
as some of the ministers who were in power at that time have admitted, this insane net zero target was waved through Parliament without any scrutiny.
Sure, but
and
that's
then
a separate
people
point.
scrambled afterwards to try to justify it. The reality is, Lewis, here's the really important point about all of this. The true cost of net zero to this country is not only the enormous amount of money that it's costing the taxpayer directly from government budgets, it's the £300 per household per year that has come in the form of subsidies that people listening to this programme are paying in their energy bills. And the UK astonishingly, has the most expensive energy costs in the world.
Yes,
and
which
again,
is
Lewis,
partly
everybody
through fossil
listening to
fuels.
your show, regardless
Partly
of their
because we're
political
reliant on fossil
persuasion,
fuels.
is terrified of opening their energy bill because it only ever seems to skyrocket.
You've also cited $7 billion of savings from DEI initiatives. Now, where's that figure come from?
So that is from an independent think tank, and I'll tweet that out at the conclusion of the show.
Right, okay, because government figures show that actual spending on DEI is £27 million. So where's the other 6.9 billion come from?
Do you think the government might have an agenda to potentially not be fully transparent about where some of this spending is going?
So you're accusing the civil service of hiding the true extent of DEI spending?
No, I'm saying that we have cited a number that an independent think tank has done thorough analysis of, and
Listeners might think you might have an agenda. You might have an agenda about DEI yourself.
Look, here's the reality, Lewis. The national budget is 1.2 trillion.
I'll tell you the reality.
The government, this government, as did the case for the Tories, they took the national debt from $1 trillion to 2.8 trillion inside 14 years. They took state spending as a percentage of GDP to Soviet Union levels at one point. Everybody knows that whenever it comes to British people, we're told there's no money left. And the notion that there is no money to cut in a £1.2 trillion budget that has not been scrutinised, that has been overseen by people who have never managed budgets before, is for the birds.
I'm sure there is plenty of money to save. My contention is testing whether you can save £7 billion of DEI, which you've claimed. It does not exist. You've made it up. Look, I'll tell you the exact figures.
Lewis, we haven't made it up. That is directly from a think tank that has done a thorough analysis of this. There's a lot of that is hidden inside Quangos, for example. The Quango budget annually is £320 billion a year.
I'll tell you what central government, let's just take central government, I'll tell you what they spend on it. 18 million for staff costs, supporting 380 full-time DEI roles. That is of a total civil service workforce of over 500,000. 500,000 for staff equality networks and 800,000 for external benchmarking and membership. Those expenditures represent 0.1%.
Lewis, a huge amount of this spending, and I know this because I personally poured over hundreds of responses to freedom of information requests that we put into, for example, for local councils. Huge amounts of this DEI spending is in fact hidden. I'm happy to say that, in the form of external consultants, in the form of consultants who charge the government huge amounts of money, hundreds of millions and billions of pounds. And by the way, you're going to hear a lot more from us now that we actually do control 10 councils, and this stuff can't be obfuscated in the form of selective responses to FOI requests. You'll hear a lot more from us in that respect.
If you get into government and you discover that 7 billion figure is at the very least exaggerated, where does the money come from then? Let's say you could save 3 billion, which I can't see any evidence that you could possibly do so, but let's just hypothetically say you could. Where's the remaining 4 billion coming from?
So, once again, the national budget is 1.2 trillion.
Yes, but you've cited DEI. You've cited specifically DEI.
And you've just asked me a question. In the scenario in which, for example, the savings were only 3 billion or 4 billion in terms of that 7 billion.
You'll find it elsewhere. Do you know where?
Well, there's lots of different places, right? So, number one, as I said, the national Quango budget, right, which are... The clue's in the name. They are autonomous, right? They are essentially acting without proper scrutiny, from what we can tell. That budget is well north of £320 billion a year. Then you have things, for example, the asylum hotels, which are $5 billion as we speak.
Very expensive.
We just had a Telegraph story yesterday, Lewis, where foreigners are taking £1 billion in the form of benefits from this country. How is that? I mean, you tell me, Lewis, how is that conscionable when we're telling British pensioners who are paid into the system their entire lives that there's no money to pay for them to heat their homes anymore? How is that justifiable when the educational attainment of 13-year-olds in Wales is below the OECD average? The notion that there is no money to be saved in these budgets, Lewis, and you know this, is for the birds.
You mentioned pensioners. Obviously, a huge proportion of government spending goes to pensions. Is it your ambition, at least, that Reform would retain the triple lock in office?
I think we've got to look at the fiscal situation in 2029, and we will announce, one thing we're going to be really clear about, Lewis, and you can hold us to this, unlike Labour, where all of their most unpopular policies were hidden from the public. They didn't tell anyone about the winter fuel allowance, or they didn't tell anyone about the inheritance tax stuff or the farmers stuff or the increase in NIC.
That's clear.
We will be very clear with the British people before the next general election about what our plans are.
One last question, Zia Yusuf. Big important, very important, perhaps underreported by-election taking place in Scotland this week in Hamilton. Not a place where traditionally either UKIP, the Brexit Party, or Reform before now has done well. Are you hopeful of winning that by-election?
I think it's a very tall order for us to win, but if we look at progress, I think there's definitely something happening in Scotland. Everybody we're speaking to there is incredibly excited about what's happening. It's really interesting. When we did our Scottish conference a few months ago, the taxi driver that took me from the airport to our venue said, it's very interesting what you're doing with reform. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, well, because I voted SNP my entire life, but I'm actually going to vote reform next time, which is very interesting. And I said, why? And he said, because I'm so sick of these establishment politicians telling us they're going to do one thing and then doing the opposite.